Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth day of Cambridge Day 2020. My name is Renata Simões, your host. How are you guys today? Big up for Curitiba, Brazil, Catamarca, Argentina, Canada, Ecuador, Poland, Spain, Uberlândia, Minas Gerais, Goiás, in Brazil. Wow, so nice to have all the ELT community with us at Cambridge Day, our annual Cambridge Day event promoted by Cambridge University Press that all years is focused on the ELT professionals, and we have a tradition. We always request you participants and our partners, of course, to donate food to local institutions. I'm talking about the project Food for Stock. It's a way of continuing to support social actions that reflect this project, Food for Thought. In this edition, we will support Ação pela Cidadania, an institution that has fighting against poverty and hunger since 1993 in Brazil. I'm sure that in time like this, you are aware of the importance of contributing to an initiative like this one. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or accessing the site of the event. Also, we have a very special invitation to you. Do you want to take part? Do you want to be part of the official video of Cambridge Day 2020? Record yourself at landscape mode, watching the webinar sessions, and send it to contato@belabaderna.com. The email is going to be here on our screen. Let me see. Yeah, contato@belabaderna.com. Remember to send us a video, not a picture. Our team will post this email on the chat, and we want you to be part of our video that celebrates Cambridge Day 2020. We hope that you can contribute to it. Now it's time to start our fourth day. Our first speaker of the day is a lecturer in academic writing and at the Center for Academic Writing at Coventry University. He has been actively engaged for many years, and his teaching covers a range of topics in applied linguistics and language pedagogy. His webinar is directed to the moment we are living these days, dealing with both language learning anxieties and also the anxiety that the virtual classroom has for itself. Please welcome Dr. Niall Curry. Hello, Niall, how are you?
Hi, Anata, I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that you are here with us. Thank you very much for your time, for your attention. Can you say, where are you exactly teaching us today? From where are you teaching us today?
So I'm at home in Rugby, which is in the Midlands of the UK. But my accent, if it's confusing for you, I'm actually from Ireland, but I'm living in the UK.
So welcome. Nice to have you here and have fun at your webinar. I think that people are very, very excited about having you here.
Super, that's great. Okay, so I think we're going to get started. As Renata mentioned, the talk that I'm going to give today will center on the issue of language learning anxiety, and specifically, I think, moving towards thinking about language learning anxieties in the current climate and how the virtual context may be adding to that, or can possibly help us address some of those issues as well. So taking kind of an overview of what this talk is about, what I want to do in this short talk is think a little bit about what language learning anxieties are. So what do we mean when we say this? And we probably have lots of ideas of what we understand an anxiety to be. So what does that mean in this context for language learning? Or does it mean anything at all? Then we want to think a little bit about managing these kind of learning anxieties. What can we do to deal with these issues that may emerge in our learners' practices for learning a language? Thinking about them generally first, and then moving on to thinking about them in these more digital contexts, I want to talk a little bit about what we can do in virtual contexts to give a bit of insight into solving these issues. And then trying to take this research, so I'm coming at it from quite a research-informed perspective, and then distill this information down to try and produce some ideas of how we can bring this into our practice. And I think that's often one of the hardest things to do is to take these really interesting insights or concepts from research and then turn them into something that we can actually do in the classroom. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have a bit of an insight into how I think at least we could go about doing that. So thinking about the kinds of learning anxieties, what I'd like you to do before we start is share in the chat what you can think of when you think of learning or examination anxieties, and what kind of things you've seen in your schools. So what does that mean to you as teachers, a language learning anxiety? So just pop some ideas into the chat there, and I'll take a look. What kinds of things happen when we talk about language learning anxieties? Yes, so we're talking about potentially learners being quite nervous in the classroom, nervous potentially to speak. Talking about issues with the affective filter, very good. So talking about how maybe negative emotions may inhibit learning. Lack of confidence, you're very right there. Issues of self-belief are emerging when we talk about language anxiety. Fears of failure, absolutely. So we have all of these really interesting ideas emerging. I worked on a project about this with Cambridge University Press a number of years ago, working with a colleague in Cambridge Assessment English, Dr. Tony Clark. And we got different kinds of insights from teachers about language learning anxiety. So I wanted to share some of these with you to see whether or not you felt that these reflected your own experiences as well. So thinking about language learning anxieties, we might have input from teachers saying things like there's problems with specific exams, and a teacher said that they're preparing students for PET exams, and that anxiety was a real problem, and they wanted to look for ways of being able to address this. For younger learners, we heard about these kind of flyers exams and students struggling to write 20 to 30 words, and then them kind of developing anxieties out of this. And also issues of things like time management and maybe putting a bit of pressure on students can create anxieties. Do these reflect your own experiences? Do these sound like things that you've seen in your own classrooms? I'm seeing lots of other examples coming through on the chat there. So I'm imagining that they do. So what I wanted to do when I was thinking about this talk initially was I wanted to think back about what we talked about then when we did this project and we looked at different kinds of anxieties and try and unpack what we can carry forward into this digital context. And what I think is really important, and this has very much guided my practices here in this kind of working through lockdown, working from home, teaching online, is that we don't try and reinvent the wheel here, that we make sure that we carry on forward so many different ideas of what we know works in our normal classrooms, and then try and bring in other ideas as well that could help us solve problems that are arising specifically in this digital context. So language learning anxiety. What is language learning anxiety? Well, I think and this is, I guess, where I got the idea for the name of my presentation, the title of my presentation. This definition from Horowitz et al. I thought was quite nice in that it talks about language learning anxiety being a distinct complex of self-perceptions, beliefs, feelings, behaviors. So all of those things that you've been talking about in the chat. A distinct complex of these items arising from the uniqueness of the language learning process. So what this tells us is that for quite some time, looking at this source being from 1986, for quite some time, language learning anxiety has been acknowledged as a unique type of anxiety that we have to address on a regular basis in our language classrooms. And so what we need to do then is think about how we can continue to address these questions of language learning anxiety and carry that forward into the digital context. And recognizing, I think, first off the bat, is recognizing language learning anxiety as its own discrete type of anxiety is key, so that we can start to unpack that a little bit and seeing that this is something that we as teachers have to engage with and that our learners have to engage with too. So what are language learning anxieties? How would we define this? Lots of really interesting kind of research in this area. And throughout this presentation, I make reference to a number of people, but a particular source that I refer to a lot is some work by Christina Gonu, who is a senior lecturer in the University of Essex in the UK, and she's done some really fantastic work on language learning anxieties. So I have some references to her, and I recommend reading more about her work as well. So language learning anxiety. It's important, I think, initially that we distinguish between the idea of a state or a trait anxiety. So what is a state anxiety and what is a trait anxiety? When we talk about trait anxieties, we're talking about this being something that's relative to the individual, whereas state anxiety, we're talking more about the idea that a particular context can create or develop a particular type of anxiety. And so in this situation, we're talking about the language learning context, the language learning classroom, the virtual classroom, or particular aspects of those contexts can be considered as kind of state anxiety provoking situations. What kind of things cause anxiety? So probably one of the most straightforward examples that we can all relate to is something like test anxiety. So different kinds of testing can create anxieties for us. But also, I guess we can think about things like interpersonal anxiety, so the ways in which we engage with people and the levels of kind of performance involved in that, and what that might mean for learners. So for example, learners feeling exposed, feeling like they're going to make mistakes, etc. Talking necessarily to the teacher, and the relationship with the teacher can impact that. So teacher-student relations, student-student relations, and myriad other contexts or examples. But really, what we're talking about here are different stimuli that will provoke some type of anxiety-like response to a particular context. What do these look like? I mean, they come in various forms, I guess, in various perspectives. We can talk about them biologically, in that we exhibit certain types of anxiety. So having to speak in front of a room full of people, we could get hot, we could get sweaty. So that kind of thing would be a biological response to some type of performance anxiety. It can affect us in terms of behavior, so it can impact what we do. And in the context of language learning, it can impact our language learning processes and how we engage with language learning. And linked to that, then, if we think about the cognitive aspect, it's about what goes on in our minds to impact these ideas of biological and behavioral responses to anxiety. And so we can think about it in multiple different ways and how it manifests as something quite impactful. We can talk about anxiety being facilitating or debilitating, which effectively means that sometimes anxiety can be helpful and sometimes it's not. I think most typically we think of anxiety as being debilitating, which means it's not very conducive to language learning. And in situations where language learning anxiety could be facilitating, we might think about things like retesting, for example, where students have previous experiences to draw on, or where there's enough of a scaffolded environment where students are made feel safe enough that the anxiety can be motivating, but not necessarily going to cause any problems for them. But I think we're probably all in agreement that for the most part, we would think about language learning anxieties as being debilitating, in that they may negatively impact the language learning process. Why all this is important is that when we think about language learning anxiety, it's been shown to negatively impact the language learning process, to negatively impact kind of student retention and getting learners to continue to engage with their learning process and to kind of push themselves forward. And so it's something that we definitely need to address. And I think about, I'm sure you'll all have experiences of this too, where we spend so much time as teachers writing out feedback and putting loads of work into the kind of things that we deliver back to our students to try and help them to be to improve as learners. But if surrounding all of this, there are kind of debilitating learning anxieties, then what we might end up finding is that a lot of that work goes to waste. So we need to make sure that we're supporting our students in as many ways as possible, so that all that work that we do is useful to them in terms of pushing them forward. So how, I think, is probably what you're wondering. How can we do this? What kind of strategies are there for managing learning anxieties? There's quite a few different things we can think of. We could talk about the strategies that we want to equip learners with. And I think maybe a broad kind of overarching way to think about this would be to think about encouraging our learners to take action. So we're not looking to implicitly help learners develop the kind of competencies. We need them to actively, explicitly engage with this challenge and find out, how they can help themselves, as well as us figuring out how we can help them. And there's a couple of different things that we could think about here. We could talk about engaging with emotional regulation, so engaging learners to try and get them to think about how they can regulate and manage their emotions. We can try and encourage learners to develop a certain degree of self-awareness. We can create maybe what we could think of as a classroom culture of openness towards issues of language learning anxieties. And like I said, just acknowledging it as a real thing in and of itself is a powerful move in doing that. We can make sure that we don't forget about this, that this isn't something that we just deal with once, but that we generally keep this in mind as we move forward. We don't want to just think that this is something that's dealt with. This is an ongoing issue. And if we want to create inclusive classrooms, personalized classrooms, accessible classrooms, then we need to keep these kind of affective issues in mind. We can try and encourage learners to develop self-regulation strategies and coming into this area of metacognition as well. And so lots of different things that we can think about. So I'm going to try and unpack some of those ideas there now into more tangible strategies. So managing anxieties. This is thinking about managing a language learning anxiety and coming back to this idea of emotional regulation. So emotional regulation is something that actually it occurs naturally in many of our already existing language learning situations. So it may not necessarily be that we need to equip our learners with skills for emotional regulation, because many of them will already have these. But what we may want to do is signal moments at which they perform emotional regulation effectively, so that they are aware of how this works for them and how they may be able to transfer this to other contexts as well. So we want to highlight these good skills that we can try and help address these kind of issues early on. And then the real challenge there is about transferring these skills. So if you think, for example, of a situation in a class where we have students having some kind of conversation in pairs or in groups, or maybe we're getting them to do a role play, what we might do is we might ask them to try and communicate with each other to solve a particular problem. And they may find that they're missing some vocabulary. They're missing a verb, they're missing some words to be able to say what they want to say. And as we're going to go through this learning process, we start to learn that, well, actually, you don't really need that one word you think you need, right? You can find another way to say it. You can work around that situation. You can come up with a way of solving that problem for yourself. And this, in a sense, is a means to avoid an anxiety-provoking situation that would block you from being able to continue. Instead of panicking, instead of giving up, instead of saying, no, I can't do this, you find recourse to get around it. And so what we want to do is try and continue to encourage that skill of finding solutions to your own problems and not being kind of focused or stuck on one particular issue. And so we want to figure out ways of transferring these practices to other ideas or other practices that we engage in. So this is the idea of emotional regulation. What we could also think about is how, excuse me, we might want to develop very self-aware learners. And what we see in the literature is that the awareness is key, and getting learners to be conscious of their needs, their purposes, their emotions, and their successful management of their emotions and those of others are really crucial for being able to effectively engage in the language learning process and take a very personal approach to managing your own emotions. I can't think of many things more personal than your emotions. So trying to do that for them will be very challenging, but equipping them with the skills to do that may be the recourse that we need. I put here a little screen grab from the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework on emotional development, because I think this is a nice resource as well. It's available online for free, and it has some interesting ideas about how we might be able to develop emotional competencies, emotional intelligences across our learners. So thinking about ways that we can create this self-awareness. I talked about the idea of creating kind of an openness in our classroom cultures in order to be able to manage language learning anxieties. So coming back to this, there's a couple of things that we can try and do in terms of strategies. We can talk about learners, getting learners to acknowledge that, imagining right now that this is a very challenging time to study, and that we really shouldn't be too hard on ourselves if things aren't going as swimmingly as we might like. There's a lot to contend with at the moment. So getting learners to acknowledge this and normalizing this. There may be a lot of people sitting in virtual classrooms thinking that they're the only ones struggling and that this isn't a normal issue. But the more we make this an authentic, real experience that is shared among people, the less kind of isolating it becomes. When we think about our learners, we can remind them get them to remind themselves rather, that struggling and even failing can show that you're learning things. So think about what you've learned and how you can improve. So, this is just a part of life. And if we let failure defeat us, then we can't really move forward. So we need to have strategies for engaging with failures and engaging with issues that we've encountered and learning from them to move on. Getting learners to focus on their successes is key as well. So we can get them to focus on what they can learn from their mistakes and encourage them to kind of reflexively engage with their mistakes as learning opportunities as opposed to evidence of failure. Comparison is an interesting one. We often talk about, trying to get learners to be competitive with one another, but being competitive with yourself is often a better way, a less emotionally straining way to look at your own development. And by that I mean, instead of looking at one other learner and thinking, okay, I want to do better than them, which isn't necessarily a great mindset to adopt, what we might do is try and position ourselves, keep track of our own development, and push ourselves to be better than the last version of ourselves that was there. So the idea being that we want to encourage our learners to focus on their own development and not compare themselves with others, because we're all kind of finding our own path through this. And so it's quite incomparable, really. It doesn't really make sense to compare. Checking in with learners as well. So this goes back to my idea of not forgetting. So keeping this narrative going, keeping this conversation going, and we're not just sitting there kind of dealing with this once and then moving on, but ongoing engagement with learners, kind of encouraging them to engage with their own emotional development. And like I said, looking at some of the emotional development work from the life competencies could be a good place to get some examples for this. So we've talked about openness in classrooms. We've talked about, we've talked about the idea of emotional development. So we want to think a little bit about other skills that we may need. And what I thought of here were issues of metacognitive strategies and learner autonomy. So much of what I've spoken about so far have been strategies to get learners to be more self-aware, to be more engaged, to be more focused on their own development, to be less competitive, and to have strategies for solving their own problems. And a lot of this will fall under areas of metacognition and learner autonomy. And so looking here, I've captured a couple of resources that I think would be useful to look into. The Learning to Learn Life Competencies Framework is all about this idea of developing learner autonomy and creating a space for learners to be able to self-regulate, to manage their own learning experiences. And equipping them with these strategies will help us to give them the skills to be able to do this in all contexts that they engage in. And so it's all about really having a means to effectively kind of communicate and effectively manage your own emotions. And our job then can be more on the lines of facilitating the development of those competencies. When we talk about some of Christina Gonu's work, and I've referenced her there several times, the work on test anxiety, there's a really great paper on test anxiety in adult learners. It's really comprehensive, and again, that's freely available. So I'm sure we can share the link around if anybody's interested. And this is a paper all about issues of learning anxieties, specifically in the context of testing, but seeing testing as a very similar state anxiety, so it's caused by the context. We can take a lot of information from this work to help us think about our learners, our teaching, and any materials that we may be developing going forward from kind of addressing an anxiety perspective. And again, a lot of what they discuss or Christina discusses in this paper is about the idea of metacognitive strategies. And so while so much of our communicative language teaching is centered on socio-cultural approaches to learning, which is bringing in our kind of Vygotskian thinking, bringing in the zone of proximal development and how people learn through interaction and communication, what we want to also try and do is take elements of these maybe more cognitive approaches to learning that, not all of these are widely applicable to language learning, but the issues of language learning anxiety and the development of these self-moderation practices can be really, really valuable. And so making sure that we're not just focusing on the social side of learning, but that we're making space for this kind of cognitive strategy development. So a lot of information there about different kinds of strategies from different areas of research. And so what we want to do is try and translate that into practice in some way and think about how does that impact on our work on a daily basis. So I spoke about this idea of us having physical responses and cognitive responses and behavioral responses to language learning anxiety and learning anxieties more generally. So what we might want to think about is how we do this. How do we manage this? So I'm going to think here specifically in terms of the physical responses, the kind of biological responses that we may have to language learning anxieties. If we want to address these, we want to try and create low anxiety classrooms, right? We want to create contexts with low anxiety kind of impact. And there's a number of ways that we could do this. We could talk about ideas of biofeedback. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the idea of biofeedback. I think it's a great term. I gave a talk once about this, and I asked people what they thought biofeedback meant, because I hadn't heard of it before. I'd read about it that time either. And one of the best responses I got was a hug, so like a hug as feedback, which I think is lovely, but it's not exactly that. Biofeedback is about recognizing our physical responses and understanding them in terms of what they're maybe reflecting in terms of our behavior or cognition. So if, for example, I'm getting kind of hot or I'm getting stressed or my heart is racing in some way, then I can start to try and think, okay, this may be representative of something else that's happening. And getting us to try and understand the physical relationship and the mental relationship, that the kind of how these ideas coincide in the kind of recognition and then therefore management of learning anxieties. The other idea was talking about priming competency, and this is about getting us to learn from each other. So if you have students who are particularly good at speaking in front of others, maybe getting them to share how they developed this competency. How did they get over any fears that they have? What strategies do they have for dealing with this? So this isn't very new, right? We talk about pairing learners together, stronger students with slightly weaker students, to kind of socially help them develop. And again, that's our zone of proximal development, right? So we want to kind of help our students by scaffolding them in terms of their linguistic development. So this is about broadening that perspective and not just thinking about their linguistic development, but thinking about their development as learners and their learning strategies. So what can I learn from this person or that person about how they solve their problems, about how they manage these situations, about how they deal with any of this kind of information. And so what we want to do is try and bring together all of this information and try and help our learners to address maybe some of these physical manifestations of learning anxieties by identifying them and then trying to help each other to solve them in some way. The second thing we might think about is looking at our kind of cognitive and behavioral strategies. And so what we can do here is we could talk about how we can give learners, Christine talks about this idea of getting them to develop a kind of a wheel of kind of choices of things that they can do to try and help them solve their problems. So teaching them to ask for advice, to reflect, to kind of use relaxation strategies, create breaks, create breakout rooms for this kind of relaxation space. allowing us to kind of skip things, creating communities and study groups, and giving as much scaffolded support as possible in order to be able to support our learners in that way. And so the idea here being that we want to develop these cognitive or metacognitive strategies, and in so doing, affect our learning strategies and our learning behaviors in order to be able to help us to manage these anxieties. So, excuse me, if you're still with me, what we have is quite a complex concept, right? I've tried to take you on a whistle-stop tour through it. Is that we have this language learning anxiety that is what we need to do is actually understand language learning anxiety. We need to think about strategies for managing these learning anxieties. And we need to think about these in this particular context of virtual learning. So you'll see that a lot of what I've spoken about so far has really centered on issues of general classroom practices, right? So I haven't actually spoken so much about the virtual classroom. And that's because, like I said, I'm more concerned with helping us kind of unpack what we do effectively in general and carry that forward. And then also think about this new context and what new opportunities or issues may arise. And so we might want to think about these classroom practices in general for teachers and learners, and think about the implications for online learning. So what does moving online bring to this challenge? And that's something I'd like you to think about for a moment. So in the chat, I'd like you to share some ideas about how might digital classrooms add to learning anxieties. What kinds of things are happening in our digital classrooms that could add to these learning anxieties? So take a moment to share some ideas in the chat, and then I'll share with you what I thought about too. I see that point that's popped up on the screen there. Very interesting. So actively, and that's such an important point. I don't know if I've made it yet, but the idea of explicitly engaging with emotional intelligence and getting learners to acknowledge that this is a thing. We're not, we don't need to be magicians who mysteriously and magically foster these brilliant learners without them even knowing. We can engage them explicitly with these kind of challenges. Yes, so with the digital environment, we have less control over the environment. There might be connection problems, people not feeling very good to put themselves on screen. So we can have some kind of apprehension there about engaging with technologies. Yes, again, not having a lot of control over the environment itself. Being alone is a very good point. So we're sitting alone in a room somewhere and talking to a screen. Although actually this feels very social, even though it's just me in a room somewhere. But I agree, it can be a challenge. And it's not necessarily all about rationality as well, right? It's quite emotional. You're right, having lots of information coming in, so not necessarily being able to filter that in the way that we might be able to do in a classroom where that would be maybe less information. And how do we kind of manage all that? Karina, great point. Not knowing how to use the platform. Such an important point. Everybody at this stage knows how to use a classroom, right? It's not difficult to use a classroom. You walk in, you sit down, and we teach. So there's a whole new level of challenge in engaging with the platform itself. So let's unpack this a little bit. So learning anxieties and digital pedagogies, what did I want to say? It's a really great source here from Russell 2020 that's all about learning anxiety and online learning. And it's published this year. It makes direct reference to the COVID context and talks about the ideas of everything that you've spoken about so far, which is this idea that when we move into online contexts, there's myriad new challenges that learners have to face. For example, just understanding the technologies and being able to effectively engage in their learning in a brand new mode. If often many of us will have been using blended approaches, maybe flipped approaches if we weren't teaching online, which even if our learners were using that, they were using it in a very different way. And so some of us might have to teach now asynchronously. And how do you develop language skills asynchronously? That's another big challenge too. So lots of different kind of anxieties that can emerge in this unknown kind of space. If we think about digital literacies and online readiness, this is really key. So we can't just assume that all of our learners are ready and capable of engaging with their online learning in a very meaningful way. They may need some time. They may need some time and some support. Like what we'd said already, they may not necessarily know how to use all of these technologies. We may not too. I don't know how many of you have had to suddenly start using technologies that you didn't really know a lot about before. And so you have to learn quickly. And so we have to think about what kind of performance and anxiety provoking situations these could foster. Is the fact that the learner doesn't know how to use Padlet or Menti or Kahoot, is that blocking them from engaging meaningfully? Is that generating too much negativity surrounding their learning? Many of you talked about this idea of kind of getting learners to speak. So there's a communication apprehension. We could talk about things like computer anxiety. Some people just don't like using technology, and internet anxiety. This, I think, coming back to the point that you made about so much information, and we have information overload. I know Delia spoke a bit about the kind of cognitive load as well. I think it was yesterday. So the idea that we're just potentially putting too much in the hands of our learners at any one time, or the mode is, it may not be that we are, but they could be looking at something else at the same time on their screen. So how do we address that? Really interesting ideas about the role of emotions in social media. I had a conversation with a colleague I work with, Dr. Kathleen Nekulai, today about this idea of netiquette. So it led me to kind of think a little bit more about this issue. So many of us use social media, we use it in different ways. And we all know that people engage with social media in slightly different ways. People have different expectations of social media too. So the value of a like, for example, may be different from one person to another. And increasingly in educational technologies, we're seeing this kind of social media type response where you can like things, you can share things, you can give emoji reactions to things. And so we could potentially be bringing students into these spaces who already have issues with that kind of communication elsewhere. And so this idea of netiquette being internet etiquette or kind of general good behavior for online, being something that we need to foster in our learners to make sure that we're creating a safe space in online virtual classrooms for learners to be able to engage with one another and with their own learning. But it's not all fear. It's not all something to worry about. We can also think about digital pedagogies as some way of helping us deal with these issues. So for example, and I don't know if you've seen this, it'd be interesting to see what you say, but I definitely have seen this in my learners, that instead of having the one or two people who are very strong, who are happy to kind of be forthcoming and give their answers to questions, even the shyer students are happy to post things on a forum or share ideas online or respond to kind of polls and mentees, etc. So the digital pedagogies can create maybe a more equitable space for shyer students to engage. Also, by using social media, it's been also shown, for example, there's interesting studies I think by Gabara et al. That was on the use of Facebook to reduce anxiety. Now, what was interesting here, and again, it would be interesting to see what you think about this, is that this was done by getting learners to create kind of a Facebook space where they would communicate as a team. So it was off the grid of teaching, as it were. And often I think I find that with my students that they create WhatsApp groups where they talk to one another. They have other spaces where they engage with one another. And so the online space that I create can sometimes be not necessarily as active as I might like, because they kind of like having their own space where they can do that too. And that's something to think about as well. Can we afford them that space? Can we trust them and let them have that space where they can start to use technology to help develop their own learning? The other point there is about getting them to collaborate with peers. So we can create, using breakout rooms and using groupings, for example, groupings through chats and things like that. We can create spaces for collaboration among peers, and again, often helping the shyer students. So basically, what this will tell us is that it's a bit of a mixed bag, and that it's largely up to how we manage it and what we equip our students to be able to do, that will help us to decide whether or not technology is helping or help us make technology help address issues of learning anxieties and language learning anxieties. So that's a lot of different information to try and unpack. So we might ask ourselves a number of questions. We might think about how can we expose learners to address learning anxieties in our teaching and learning? And does virtual or online learning help make it worse? Help or make it worse, rather, or how? So what we want to kind of think is try and think about how we can help develop these strategies among learners and what role technology can play. How can we as teachers respond to this need? How can we exploit technology and online learning to help? So what can we make technology do for us? And similarly, how can learners respond to this need and how can they exploit the technology? Remember, I spoke quite a bit about the idea of learner autonomy. I spoke about the idea that we have different issues that we want to kind of have learners be able to respond to by themselves. So we need to make sure that the learners have an active role in this too. And it's not just us that can solve this problem. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about your virtual online classrooms. And I'd like you to come up with 4 classroom rules. And this is an activity that you could actually do with your students, have them all come up with rules and get them to prioritize rules and then make those your virtual classroom rules. So 4 classroom rules that can foster low anxiety online classrooms. So I'd like you to share some ideas in the chat, and then I'll share with you some ideas that I had of things that we could do to try and create this culture. And going back to the point made earlier that this is something we can do explicitly. So I liked the idea of that emotional intelligence class that you mentioned. So I'll give you a moment to share some of these ideas in the chat. Come up with 4 ideas that could help foster low anxiety online classrooms. Respect each other, good idea. Encourage collaboration, absolutely. Very good. So don't laugh at other classmates' mistakes, okay? So be accepting of other people's mistakes. I like this idea from Maria. You don't have to turn your camera on if you don't want to. So choice is a really big part of anxiety as well. So when I talked about online readiness, a lot of online readiness and solving issues of online readiness is about giving learners choice. So getting them to be able to do that. So, oh yes, would you like me to go back to the previous slide? I think I see it. I can do that. Okay, so be kind, be on time, respect each other. Very good. Some really good ideas coming in here. More openness, make time for meditation. Again, yes, really nice ideas coming through. So I think, yes, all of these are things that we can do. And again, I think this is a really nice activity to be able to make it more learner-centered. We can actually ask the learners to help come up with these ideas too. So as a group, we can decide, and you can use polls to help vote on things. So you can use some nice little technologies. You could use a shared Google Doc to help them write these. And you could also make this a language learning task by getting them to say, use modals, for example. You must do this, you mustn't do this, you should do this, etc. Have fun. Totally agree, Maria. I think that's a really important point as well. So let's see what I came up with. I don't think they're nearly as good as the ideas that you've had. So I said, I was thinking about online posts. Make sure that you respond to posts that have not yet had a response. So the idea there being that nobody likes if they post something on Facebook or Twitter and nobody comments on it or likes it at all. And some students might not feel very good about posting things because they're worried that people won't respond. So encouraging learners to be able to to do that, to respond to the posts that have not yet had responses. We could talk about using emojis to express emotions and tone, but making sure that we do that in the context of netiquette, right? That we're not going to make people feel bad with our emojis too. So making sure that we're creating this kind of nice space for one another. Seeing really good examples coming through still. Asking for help, I think this is so key. So in kind of some of my online write-ups, if I have on my VLE, I might put something like, if you're not sure how to use this technology, let me know. So what that does is two things. It normalizes the idea that we might not know how to use this technology, and that's okay. And so that way, if someone's sitting at home, they're not thinking, oh, I'm the only one who doesn't know how to do this thing. So we can normalize that a little bit. And it gives also develops this metacognitive strategy of help seeking, which is something that we want to do in general in fostering our learners. And again, something more generic, we might be able to get them to focus on their successes, like what has been really effective in these language learning contexts, and how can you use them as evidence of your success and not necessarily focus on your failures. So addressing learning anxieties within your classroom then, what we would think about is how we can embed these strategies within our teaching. So we want to embed them within our teaching, and we don't necessarily need to think about creating specific anxiety management tasks, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to create a very special time for this, but we can try and thread it through all of what it is that we're doing. And so again, I'm just going to show you some examples of things that I came up with here. So if we wanted to help learners to identify if, for example, if they're struggling in their class, we could bring in a peer who's dealt with the issue that they've had already in order to solve a particular problem and get them to share how they've done it. So this is bringing our near peers in to be able to show us how we can address these issues. So often learners will learn better from someone who's like them, and so why not get a learner from another level to be able to show how that can be done. If in your planning you anticipate an anxiety-provoking situation, you could always open with a reflection for learners, asking them to think about how they've addressed similar problems in the past. So that way they have a bit of a place to move from. Well, in the past I did this, and this is how I could solve this problem going forward. So we want to get to kind of include recordings and get learners to kind of focus on how they capture evidence of their learning to counter any feelings of anxiety. And we also want to normalize help seeking and normalizing the idea that there may be issues with technology, and we all have issues with technology. So let's not make people feel like they don't know how to use them, because this is all so new. The other idea, we can model and signal good practices for online engagement, learning, and development. So we can try and make sure that we're demonstrating that too. Getting learners to identify strengths in others by getting them to activate this idea of priming competency. We can encourage learners to personalize their rubrics, so getting them to reword instructions that we're giving them for assessments, for example, or for how to engage with things in technology, put them into their own words so that they own those words and they understand them better. And encourage collaborative community-based online behaviors through classroom rulemaking and interaction patterns. So make sure that this is all coming together in some kind of community approach. We're trying to solve our problems as a group. Again, we don't have to pretend to our learners like we know everything is solved and perfect and it's all smooth behind the scenes. We can include them in solving this problem, because this is something that we're all facing together, and they'll recognize that too. So what I'd like you to do before I give a very brief summary is I'd like you to think for a moment about all of this information that I've given you, which I think is quite maybe a lot of information to process in a short space of time. And I'd like you to share in the live chat one thing that you think you could take into your practice going forward from today. What could you do in terms of trying to address this issue of language anxiety going forward? Is there any one little idea that came to mind as I was speaking through these ideas? So feel free to share some ideas in the chat there. I'll give you a moment. This is just a bit of a reflective moment in this session, just to give you a chance to consolidate some of these ideas that I've shared with you as well. Yeah, I totally agree. Openly talking about anxiety, not being too implicit about it, and making it something real, grounded, authentic for the learners. Creating the rules, absolutely, so we can try to bring these rules into the class and make the learners really part of this community of learning as well. We're learning together, Swelly, absolutely. Being more empathetic with our learners, absolutely. So much to try and just kind of thread into our practice. And I think what I wanted to do with this is to show that while language learning anxiety may be a complex concept, while the research in this area may spread across lots of different contexts and fields, what we do in practice doesn't need to be so convoluted, right? It can be something really small, like having an open conversation by getting learners to redesign rubrics, as Fathia has mentioned. So many different approaches that we can take. So just to move us forward, in terms of what I wanted to do with this session, I wanted to try and access this idea of this unique challenge and kind of situate it maybe more concurrently in this climate of online and virtual learning. So this is a challenge that we're facing. And I wanted to make sure that what we did was not reinvent the wheel, but that we tried to bring forward certain practices that we knew worked, and then we tried to see how they fit within this new virtual context. And so I think what we need to kind of maintain a focus on is this overlap between our online context, between language learning more generally, and between the kind of language learning anxiety, and making sure that we're considering these three different kind of contexts or variables in order to make sure that we're supporting our learners from different perspectives. So that's, I think, in general, what I wanted to talk to you about here today, and I'm very happy to take some questions going forward. I have my sources here so we can get this shared with you, and if you would like any more information, just feel free to get in touch. And happy to leave it there for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Niall Curry. It's a pleasure and I'm honored to have you. I think that we have already had a feedback from the people on chat, but yes, we do have a lot of questions to you. I think it's a very, how can I say, it's the topic of the moment in a way, dealing with anxiety and the online classes. So our first questions come from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Can we deal with students with depression, especially with the pandemic that's going far? The problem is increasing, going worse. What's your thought on that?
I mean, it's such a big challenge. So I think there's a couple of things that we should think about here. Is what can we do as language teaching professionals, and what is the extent of our role? How be able to effectively manage and give advice to learners dealing with very serious conditions like depression. I think that what we can do well, I guess, within our context of trying to create safe spaces for learning, trying to create open discourses for acknowledging these issues and challenges that our learners are facing, and trying to just not make this stuff kind of hidden. Just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So making sure that we're bringing it to the fore. But as far as it goes to kind of dealing with medical issues as well, I guess we also have to recognize our constraints, that we may not necessarily have the right advice or the right information to be able to solve all these problems for our learners too. So finding that balance in between. And I think, if you're working in an institution where there is counseling support, or if there's a place where you can offer kind of direction to the learners to be able to access counseling support, that's something that we can do too. So helping learners maybe come to the recognition that they need to seek extra help elsewhere is something that we can definitely do. But whether or not we have the answers to be able to solve issues of depression, I think, is a bigger question, and probably not one that we all feel like we can solve either.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Tenancingo, Mexico. Francisco, can you give us some tips on how can students deal with anxiety when it comes to speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think There's some really interesting work. So if you look for the Cambridge papers in ELT, there's a good paper called Safe Speaking Environments. And that's all about how we can create and scaffold learners in tasks and contexts in order to be able to build up their ability to be able to speak. And so it's about giving them the right amount of time to be able to do this, so we're not rushing them. Often we try and include speaking in classes, but it might be towards the end of a class, or it maybe is squished into a very short amount of time. And learners actually, they probably need a bit more time to kind of set themselves up and carry through those activities. So making sure that there's enough time for speaking, thinking about our feedback practices in speaking as well. So trying to create a culture where we give positive feedback. Often with feedback, learners will be more likely to remember the positive feedback. So acknowledging the things that they've done well, and they're more likely to kind of take that into account moving forward. Whereas negative feedback and corrective feedback, I think the jury's out still on how effective that is for developing kind of accurate learners going forward. So thinking about our feedback practices is key. And I think there's also a part of it that is to do with the task. That often when learners are worried about speaking, it's because they're so focused on the challenge of actually producing language. So they're thinking about their grammar, they're thinking about their pronunciation, they're thinking about their accent. And what we can do is we can try and distract them from this by getting them to do something that's learner-centered, that they find really interesting, getting them to do something that's really immersive, so that they're so invested in the task that they're not really thinking about what the task is for anymore, that it's not about using modals, it's not about using the present perfect, it's not about adverbs, it's now about this really interesting problem that I'm trying to solve through language, and getting them to focus more on what they do with language as opposed to how they produce it can distract them from these situations that may be kind of generating these anxieties, which is a lot of it's to do with performance and fear of making mistakes and producing inaccurate language.
Perfect. Next question. Breno Giglio from Petropolis. How to control anxiety when their parents charge them to be perfect? How to make they realize perfection isn't real?
I think that's such a good point. And it also takes into account this kind of relationship that we need to have with parents too. Language learning in its own way is it's littered with mistakes, right? I mean, when do you stop making mistakes? I haven't. I've learned French and Spanish, and I regularly still make mistakes with French and Spanish. So I think that we need to normalize the idea that errors are not necessarily something that signals a lack of ability or a lack of aptitude. And I guess thinking about how we communicate to our teachers, or to the parents rather, about how, what is the impact of a particular grade, or why is something happening, and trying to think about, I guess, how we can make clear to parents that making mistakes and having problems in language is not an issue. It's just part of the process, right? We make mistakes as we learn. If what we could do, I mean, right, we could learn a little bit of language and learn that little bit of language really well and only ever say that, and we could be perfect, right? We could be perfect, but we would never get better. So we need to make mistakes to learn. It's just part of the process. And the more that we can normalize that idea, and you're totally right, getting that message to parents who maybe are thinking about, getting every answer right in maths as being the same as never getting grammar wrong in English, that we need to make sure that message gets across. It's a really good point.
Perfect.
A big task.
A lot of comments on that. So clean and thought-provocative. Excellent discussion. Thank you, Neil. Gabriela Pratizagar from Belo Horizonte. How the anxieties can reflect on learning process?
So, I mean, it's well established that language learning anxieties can have a very negative impact on the learning process. So what they can do is a number of things. They can stop learners who, for example, a learner may have prepared really well for an exam, but the context of the exam can be so anxiety provoking for the learner that all of the work that they've done just doesn't come to them in this performative moment, and it blocks them from being able to perform. Similarly, we can learn lots about speaking and speak in class, but we go out into the world and we speak to somebody in English in an authentic situation, and we can be blocked from that too. In terms of the learning process as well, by focusing on failures and developing kind of learning anxieties that impede us from recognizing that we can develop further, that block us from thinking about how to better engage with any mistakes we make, or how to improve on our failures, all of that will stop us from improving and developing. And so what we need to do is try and learn how to set aside those negative feelings that we get when we don't succeed in something, and recognize that focusing on them will only keep us further back from what we're trying to do. So in terms of language learning anxieties and impacting the learning process, the idea of like the behavioral and cognitive blocks that can take place are really well established. And so that's why, sorry, just to add to that, that's why I was saying at the beginning that all the work we do on feedback, giving all this detail to our students, working really hard to help them, all that work needs to, I guess we need to think about that and whether or not it's working if the learner is blocking themselves from engaging with that actively owing to a learning anxiety.
Oh, amazing. Micaela Soledad from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Niall, I hope you are very well at these times. My question is, what about your emotions as a teacher in the classroom?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that generally, I try to be quite transparent with my students. So I at the end of every class that I would teach, I would check in to see how they're doing, and how this current lockdown situation that they may be in is affecting them. And what I try to do as well is just say, this is all, it's really great that we're still learning and we're doing all this work, but at the moment there are a couple of things happening that are probably a little bit more important than what we're doing in this classroom right now, and not to dwell too much on being perfect with all of this stuff, and to really acknowledge the challenge that we're in this situation across the world, and not to try and pretend like it's not happening, and to kind of just focus on the classroom content. So I try to actively engage with that, and I try to check in with my students. And I mentioned earlier the idea of modeling good behavior. And so I try to be transparent about the kind of situations that I'm in too, in order to make it normal for them to be able to share their situations as well. And I think that's key, because that's part of creating a safe and open classroom culture.
Perfect. Jaume Vanderlei from Recife, Pernambuco. Isn't the criteria in assessment and the whole culture of summative assessment a quite important part of students' anxiety?
Absolutely. I think when we think about summative assessments, it's hard because what students end up fixating on are scores, right? So they just want to know the score. They want to know what grade they got. They want to know the number that they got. And what we I guess want to shift students towards is maybe including more formative assessment approaches, or looking at assessment through learning or assessment for learning. And so what we can think about is, in our in-class assessments, not these being a test of their knowledge, but being a way for students to identify what they still need to work on, right? So we're using testing as a way of progress checking. We're using testing as a way of figuring out what I need to develop further and where I'm okay. And if we can try and change students' perspective that scores are not a determination of their value as people, of their value as speakers, they are a reflection of how they responded to a particular test that was testing a very particular thing. And so in order to be able to respond better to that test, then we need to identify what areas in which we're a bit weaker and we want to develop. And so seeing kind of trying to switch that narrative from summative to either formative, or for kind of learning through assessment, as it were.
Well, thank you very much. Our chat is on fire. The questions keep coming, but unfortunately, we have a limited time. Thank you very much,
No,
Dr. Niall.
Thank you, everyone.
Any final words? Do you want to leave your email? Please, it's your open space now.
Well, I want to say thank you to everybody for getting so involved, and you've given me so many useful ideas to think about. And I think perhaps what's quite a nice takeaway to think about is that the points that I made, the kind of ideas that I shared about issues of anxiety, that were reported by teachers came from teachers all over the world, and that was done a couple of years ago. And the idea of a language learning anxiety was, I had a reference dating back to 1986. And the issues that we're all facing today are very much unchanged. And so thinking about this as it's almost a global issue, right? Anywhere I've been in the world to talk to teachers about this has been a problem that we faced. And so it's something that as a community globally that we can all kind of work to address. And I think it's also something that unites us as well. So a big challenge, but an opportunity as well.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Niall.